next slide, please, if possible.
Cool.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on monitoring as code from Checkly and Coralogix. So this is the first of a three-part webinar series. We're going to be covering a lot of different things here. Today is all about a really straightforward foundational entry into monitoring as code. The aim of the game is to sort of get us all onto the same level. Yeah, Jonathan, you do the agenda?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what we're going to be covering today, really, right, is just making sure that we align on some foundations. So we'll be talking over some helpful definitions and core principles of monitoring as code. We'll show you some proper definitions, but we're mainly going to be having a discussion about things that we think are most pertinent for folks that are adopting monitoring as code or are currently already using monitoring as code. We'll be covering what Checkly and Coralogix do very, very briefly before we move on to some practical approaches to monitoring as code centered around the age-old question of, do I couple my resources or not? So it might get a little spicy. We'll have a bit of Q&A, and then we'll tee you guys up, or you all up, for what's coming next. And here we are. Chris, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'd be glad to. Talking about myself is my favorite hobby. Hi everybody, I'm Chris. I am Director of Developer Relations here at Coralogix. So my job is to just talk to engineers, make engineering content. My whole background, I was an SRE for 5 years. I was a Java engineer before that. So there's like a karma to my career because for the first few years I made apps that makes DevOps people want to cry, and then I had to support those apps. So it was a real karmic journey for me, which was fantastic. Now I'm obviously just attending conferences, making content, building interesting apps, solving problems, and hopefully doing something useful for the DevOps community on behalf of Coralogix. So that's me, Jonathan.
Cool. Good. Always good to hear more about you, Chris. I'm a fan of listening to you talk about yourself. My name is Jonathan Canales. I'm a senior solutions engineer here at Checkly. Prior to that, I was at a really large test automation framework company that you guys might know. Previous to that, I was building some custom web applications that I didn't test at all. So very similar to Chris here. I was building a lot of projects and not really having to encounter the after effects of said projects. So I got into the testing space and I really fell in love with Playwright. And then I was introduced to Checkly because if folks on this call don't know, we use Playwright under the hood to do things like browser checks. And I just kept doing more research about the company, and we do a lot of really cool stuff here. And monitoring as code actually was very easy to get into because of its sort of gateway between Playwright into synthetics. So it's been an interesting journey so far, and I'm super excited to be on a call with you guys. In addition to that, just like Chris, I talk to customers and users every day. I ask a lot of questions, I break a few things, and I help people along the way. So that's me. Let's continue to move forward. Chris?
Yeah, so some basic rules. Ask questions whenever you want in using the Q&A. We do have a Q&A section at the end because we know that like often ideas come to you towards the end of the webinar, but ask them whenever you want, and we'll endeavor to answer them throughout the webinar rather than pushing them all to the end. Yeah, I suppose it goes without saying, keep the questions polite, but I mean, it's up to you. Make them impolite if you really want. It's up to you. I don't really mind. It doesn't bother me. So yeah.
Awesome. So before we roll into the majority of the content we'll be working through today, we're going to take a brief aside here and just kind of explain what each of our companies do. If you guys haven't heard of us, or maybe you've heard of one but not the other, as I shared previously, I work for Checkly. We're a synthetic monitoring solution that allows you to monitor things like cron jobs, Kubernetes clusters, single-step, multi-step APIs, web applications, etc., all the way from development, staging, however many QA environments you may or may not have, production, and then of course the result of these things are, alerts, status pages, the ability to do visual comparison, hashtag beta, and then obviously also do things like data exporting with tools like Prometheus and Grafana, and also really well-rounded solutions like Coralogix. My friend Chris will tell you a bit more about that.
I'll be happy to. Coralogix is a full stack observability platform, so we process logs, metrics, and traces. We also have a really nice security platform as well. The observability space is extremely crowded, and if I tell you a bunch of the stuff, it'll just sound like any other observability provider. So I'll just tell you very, very briefly what makes us different. Number one, the fastest SLA on the market besides us is measured in hours. Our SLAs are measured in minutes. Our response time is 15 seconds. There's no bots, and the person you're speaking to is an engineer. So we've got a really fast response. The platform itself is built on a completely different architecture called Streamer that allows you to ingest your data. It doesn't have to be indexed. It can be cost optimized. This is the only platform with true cost optimization. So it's solving the data scale problem in observability, and it's solving the cost optimization problem in observability as well. You can see some of the features here. We have tons of them. There'd be no point making a dashboard, but if you're interested, check out the website, sign up for a demo. We have a free trial. It'd be awesome to see you guys. And my contact details are all over the website. So find me on LinkedIn if you want to ask some specific questions. It's absolutely fine. Coralogix has been around for a while. We have several thousand customers, and we're really keen to keep going. So if you are in the market for an observability solution, just get in touch, and we'll see how we can help. But yeah, save you some money.
Awesome. Awesome. So here we are. We're getting to the meat and potatoes of the actual webinar. I figured you'd like that, Chris, being from the UK.
Oh, yeah.
But here we are, right? So here are some helpful definitions in case you came to this webinar without knowing what monitoring as code is. Again, we're going to reframe some of these things using common language. To me, I think, and Chris, I'd love to hear your thoughts after I explain what monitoring as code is. To me, monitoring as code is the ability for you to really get going with creating monitoring resources and things like we just showed you, like the outcomes, right? So status pages, alerts, etc., all through code. So it's something that's implemented through your regular CI/CD lifecycle, and it's in version control. And it allows you to do all these things without having to do something like ClickOps, right? Going to a site, clicking through a bunch of maybe synthetics, or making a bunch of choices that then you'll have to fix later on when something has changed. All this is done through code. So you're able to do all of this work and make any updates all through code. Chris, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that with monitoring as code, it's obviously this emerging practice. So everybody in this audience here is primarily interested in becoming really familiar with what this is, because it's not really a mainstream thing. You wouldn't expect to be asked about it in an interview. And so the benefits of it aren't always clear. Look, the thing with monitoring and observability in general is more and more companies are running into this problem of scale, whether it's volume of data, whether it's number of resources, whether it's cost, whatever. Things are scaling really fast, much in the same way that the infrastructure in the cloud did a few years ago. We realized we have a lot more infrastructure than we ever have before, and we need a solution for that problem. And that's the role that monitoring as code plays. It fills that gap of scale. And so the real value here is if you have a lot of resources, because if you only have a few resources, manage them however you want, you won't really run into any of the big problems. As soon as you begin to touch scale, then you will notice that monitoring as code is going to become really, really valuable. Yeah. So full stack observability is the next one, which I think I will grab. So generally speaking, full stack observability, the out of the box answer is this. It's observability with logs, metrics, and traces. Okay, it's a bit of a boring answer, and I always like to add a little bit extra to this, which is it's not just about having logs, metrics, and traces. It's about correlating all of those logs, metrics, and traces together into a single investigative journey. So, for example, if you're looking at logs and you see an error, you can correlate that very easily with your metrics. Then when you see that it's all coming from a single application, you can view the traces for that application. So the idea being is that you don't just have access to logs, metrics, and traces, you have simultaneous access to logs, metrics, and traces in really innovative ways. And that's something that Coralogix absolutely kills it at. We're really, really good there. But that is, in my opinion, the true definition of full stack observability. I don't know if Jonathan, you've got any other sort of perspectives on that.
Of course you absolutely killed it. No surprise there, right? It's what you do. You're a
Yeah.
professional. I applaud you. Um, so I'll go ahead and take synthetic monitoring. I think, this is a perfect segue actually, right? To talk about full stack observability and the idea that you can gather all these things in one place and have all these insights. Synthetic monitoring, right, is a way of actively monitoring your web applications APIs, right, like cron jobs and things like that. So what this allows you to do is it actually allows you to generate some really beautiful data that a solution like Coralogix will be able to help you parse through, right? Because if I'm checking a login flow every 5 minutes, every minute, right? What that's really doing is generating a data point that, hey, when something starts to change, if you're using, right, a tool like Checkly, you can obviously see when something has degraded and send you alert if something fails. But what you get from both of these sort of approaches, right, implementing them, is that all of a sudden you get all of this really lovely data over a prolonged period of time. And so you can start spotting things like regressions in performance, or start seeing like, hey, I think we're actually moving towards a failure here. We need to go ahead and take an active role in what we do next versus waiting for something to fail and getting an alert. Chris, do you have any thoughts there before we move forward?
I haven't, as with my full stack observability, you're rather good at explaining synthetic monitoring. There is a question from Shweta in the chat though, which is, can synthetic monitoring also include user initialization or onboarding, or purely after the fact, assuming user is onboarded and just user interactions? So, is there a role for synthetic monitoring in the onboarding process as well as the experienced users already using the platform?
Yeah. Maybe I might have misunderstood that, but I'm going to answer it to the best of my ability. What I'm hearing you ask is about more about how synthetic monitoring can monitor maybe like user flows to create users. Am I getting that wrong, Chris?
I would. I think that's a fair response. Shweta, feel free to clarify in the chat if you want. Yes, yeah. You're
Cool.
on the money, mate. You're on the money.
Oh,
Shweta's happy.
okay,
So.
cool. Then I'm going to go ahead and go with absolutely yes, right? So the idea of being able to test your critical app flows, like sending payments, creating new users, logging in, etc., is exactly what synthetic monitoring is for. Because in particular, Checkly is using Playwright under their hood. You can create a new user by, clicking around, logging in with Playwright, and then after you've created that user, going, doing like an API call and removing that user from your database every time they're created. So in this way, you can see that true end-to-end sort of approach for testing bleeding over into actively monitoring. So great question.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much for that. And keep the questions coming, please. That'd be really, really great. And there's one question here,
Awesome.
which is, we are currently using Sentry.io for APM monitoring. How might this integrate with Sentry? I believe we have a direct integration with Sentry. I would recommend have a look at the Coralogix website. We've got documentation to cover everything that one might expect for if you did want to integrate Sentry with Coralogix. Jonathan, do you know if Sentry has an integration with Checkly at all?
I'm fairly certain we do. And if not, we do have the ability for you to create a custom webhook and point that anywhere you like, right? So we've got something like 18 integrations plus a custom webhook. So if it's not on there, let us know and we'll be happy to hack something together and make sure you're on the way.
Smashing. Cool.
Cool,
Let's
cool.
push forward. Yeah. So these are just some of the core principles. So Jonathan and I selected these based on our experience, but the idea is that these are the things you're gonna run into. These are the things you need to have in your arsenal ready to go for when you're embarking on that monitoring as code journey. As we said at the start, the idea here is to give everybody in this course a sort of foundational base level, so we're all moving from the same point into the more complex webinar episodes. So some of these are going to seem basic and straightforward, but some of them I think have details that are going to be quite interesting. So the first one is lifecycle management. So just to give you an idea, there are two life cycles here actually to think about. The first is the life cycle of an actual resource in a classic way. So you create the resource, you update the resource, you delete the resource, you might move it around and so on. This is the typical resource lifecycle management. There's also what's actually happening in the observability platform, because these resources aren't just sitting there. Alerts are triggering, they're remediating, they're being acknowledged, and so forth. So state changes are happening both in the platform and in your code repository as well. So in a different way to, in sort of similar sense in the infrastructure as code space, where one might expect server counts to go up and down. That is a change of state after all. And the same thing can happen with your alarms, with your dashboards, whatever. Minor changes can happen. And so a good lifecycle management policy when you're implementing monitoring as code is to be aware of that natural fluctuation, that natural change. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on to that, Jonathan.
No, this is spot on.
Awesome. And the other one is that I'm going to talk about is integrated in the developer workflow. So this is, I think, this is one of the core benefits of monitoring as code, but it is also one of the big challenges as well. So the idea is simple. When you implement monitoring as code, you're bringing the process of management, of creation, of optimization of those resources much closer to the engineers. That's a good thing. You know, shifting left has been a pretty common practice now for a very, very long time. There's no need to make an argument for it. It's generally a very, very good thing. And however, if you want to go down that route of giving engineers the control, you also have to start thinking about, well, how does this fit into the workflow? Do these resources behave the same way as other resources? We just discussed some of the similarities and differences with infrastructure as code. So these resources don't always behave in the same way that other resources might. Therefore, you have to make sure your developer workflow fits the monitoring as code cycle as well, so you completely understand what the ramifications are going to be when you introduce these kinds of resources. CI/CD has as we say towards the bottom, has a big implication there as well. Jonathan, I'll let you take the next couple.
Awesome. Yeah, perfect segue. It's like we put these in order or something, right? So I really like this next one following, because it's about using a high level syntax, right? So if you're looking at a monitoring as code tool and you can't figure out quickly what it's doing, right? What an example is doing, and it's hard to get going, etc. That's a sign that it's probably not, number one, probably not the best tool for you. But number two, what we really need to be aware of when we're rolling out these sorts of solutions to, you know, both really small organizations with, you know, a tight development team and really large organizations with, you know, 1,000 developers, is how easy is it going to be for someone to look at your code and know what's happening, right? The more time it takes for me to have to go run somewhere, look at the docs, cross my fingers and hope that I understand what's going on, etc., that's going to reduce our overall quality, right? That's going to reduce our confidence in what we're working with. That's going to reduce the amount of time. Actually, it's going to increase the amount of time it will take to implement. So a really good monitoring as code solution uses a high level syntax, or uses, you know, syntax that you're already familiar with, for example, like Terraform, right? So both Checkly and Coralogix can use Terraform and have really great first-class providers. Terraform also has its own high-level syntax, so that's spot on. It's a check for both of us there. I'm going to hit the next two really quickly, and then we'll move into some practical examples. So adopt software principles. I mentioned this earlier, right? We want to make sure that what we're putting together, that what we're using to create these resources and monitors, that it's version controlled, and that anytime something changes, we can literally know who to blame when something goes wrong. Looking at you, Chris. And you know, we also want it to be baked in like our other software solutions, right? So regardless if we're coupling or decoupling our resources, we want to be able to adopt new solutions using the same patterns of other solutions we're already using, because again, that's going to reduce the amount of implementation time we have. That's going to improve our overall management of that solution. And the last one, of course, is the most important part, is that it's integrated within CI/CD, right? I mentioned earlier getting away from this practice of ClickOps, right? So anytime we're doing something that's not version controlled, that we don't have an idea of how it's impacting our ability to, push code, launch new features, etc., because it's outside of CI/CD. We lose the ability to actually do our best work, right? Because if something goes wrong, if it's not integrated in CI/CD, we're making some updates, and hey, maybe if we would have been, how can I say, maybe if we would have been monitoring staging, we would know that our QA environment's actually bad, right? And that's why our push just failed. It's not because our code's actually broken, it's because the environment's unreliable. That sort of differentiator, right, makes all the difference between giving your developers a giant headache and a giant magnifying glass to play Sherlock Holmes for a few hours, or the ability to just kind of continue to move forward. Yeah, I like using analogies. We'll get over it together. But that's it. Any thoughts here, Chris, before we move forward?
No, I just love the Sherlock Holmes reference. I'm big on that. That's good. I like how the Britishness is like slowly creeping into your mind. I love it. I heard spot on as well. I was like, this is brilliant. This is fantastic. Okay.
You see, I have Chris's approval. I can't see the chat or Q&A, so hopefully it's going well in there. I'm gonna move
Yeah.
forward now.
Just a reminder,
Practical
guys.
examples.
Yeah, just a reminder, guys. Ask questions whenever you want. If there's anything here that you're not sure about, don't worry about any questions being too basic or whatever. Just fire away. It's more, the more the merrier. So yeah, sorry, Jonathan.
You're
Yeah.
good.
So
Yeah.
practical examples. We decided to tackle a really common problem. The reason why we tackled this problem in episode 1 is really straightforward, because this is the first problem you're going to run into. It's how do I organize my monitoring as code resources? How do I actually set this stuff up? You have essentially 2 options, and Jonathan and I are going to go through some examples of those options and how the code may look. You have coupled and decoupled. So when we say coupled, we mean that when you look to your application repository, you can see all of the alerts that are helping to observe that application, the dashboards, any logging rules, any synthetic monitoring automation that's been implemented for that application. The idea is you can see how the whole universe of that application, including how it is observed. Decoupled would be more like you have a repository that says, this is my observability repository, this is my MaC repository, and I am putting all of my resources in there. And there are some serious pros and cons to both of these different approaches. But where you place the code, that decision you make early has ripple effects. Because if you're not, it depends what kind of problems you want to optimize for. And that's very specific to your company. And that's why we decided to show both of these rather than just giving an opinionated stance, because it's really, really important that for your company, you make the exact right decision. I can
I'd
see
like to add a small note here too, is that it also depends on who's implementing it, right? So Chris, you coming from that SRE background, maybe you have a predilection to decouple resources, whereas me coming more from a software development testing background, I love when everything's all together. It makes me feel safe. So that's what I'll say there. But I think you were going to pick up a Q&A.
Yes, yeah. There's a question from Ben, which is, we struggle a lot with tracing errors across our different services. The error may be originating in our GraphQL server, but propagates through the web app or a cloud function. Sentry treats these issues as unique, and it's all noise. I can tell you one platform that won't treat them as unique, and that's Coralogix. So check us out. But yes, noise is a real issue. It's not just related to Sentry and everything. Noise is a big problem. It's related to this data scale thing because there's simply lots of requests, but also because so many companies just aren't acknowledging that it's a big issue, and they're making cool looking dashboards before they're actually tackling the sort of fundamental first principles problems that exist in observability today. So yes, Ben, feel your pain 100%. Check out the Coralogix website. I'm sure we'll be able to help. But definitely some monitoring as code approaches are going to help as well. Because the really, really important thing is that you can track and understand which resources exist and whether you're monitoring and tracking those problems in the right way. We're going to talk about that in the decoupled section, actually. So that should hopefully maybe help give you some ideas about how you can tackle this.
And we're also tackling this idea of alert fatigue in our next webinar. So spot on. Great question.
Yes.
Good shout, as Chris says.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions before we move forward with the practical examples?
Yeah, so Jeff has asked, why version monitoring code for each app version unless APIs change? So I think Why version monitoring code for each app version unless APIs change? Jeff, I'm not completely sure. I'm understanding that question. If you wouldn't mind just rephrasing slightly, and we'll certainly pick it up, if that's okay. So yeah, let's get into
Cool.
the.
You,
Oh, I see. Yes. Why version? Yeah. Well, oh, I see. Like, what's the point in version monitoring code feature? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes. I mean, look, it's going to be an opinion based thing, Jeff. But Jeff is on the decoupled team, by the way, Jonathan. So good man. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's good to have someone on my team. It's nice. Cool. Um,
awesome. Are you able to share your screen, Chris? I think you were going first, right?
yes. Let's do it. Yeah. So how do I? Yes, I want to continue, and I click this button here, and we should all be able to see a
It's,
VS Code repository. Can you see that, Jonathan?
yeah, I can see it perfectly.
Brilliant. And I hope everyone in the audience can see it as well. So this would be an example of laying out in a decoupled approach. So there's a few questions you have to ask yourself when you go about doing this. Number one is how am I gonna organize my data? Essentially, how am I going to index my resources? So here's how I've done it. We have a single repository, and I've broken it down firstly by the actual type of resource that we're going to create. Now, for some people, that's going to be controversial. They prefer to do it by business unit or application or whatever. It's kind of up to you. I think I like this because one of the big powers of a decoupled approach, one of the big pros of a decoupled approach, is that you can then have a look at how things are being done generally. So if someone wants to define a new alert, they have to first verify that the same alert doesn't already exist. And how do you do that? In the alert section. If you break down alerts into lots of subdirectories, it maybe gets a little bit more tricky. So doing that first indexing on resource type is something that I've seen done. It works quite well, but it is quite nice. The second real power of a decoupled approach is you can enforce like naming conventions, so things that you would have seen in an infrastructure as code repository. So I've implemented this variables file here, for example, and I have org name and team name in my Terraform code here. I can see I can put some validation on there. I can make sure that things are implemented. And now when I define my resources, I could define, for example, something in here. You can see that I have org name and team name. So what I'm guaranteeing is that the names of my resources are going to follow some consistent convention. And the power of that is it creates searchability. Searchability is super important because it means that I can look for, okay, if I'm looking for all of the applications held by this team. I'm looking for the applications held in this particular business unit. Now, I've used org name and team name as an example. Pick the variables on which it's really crucial that you want to be able to search these resources. That's what's really going to matter here. That's what's going to make all the difference in the world is, can I search on the things that matter to me? So when I say search, I mean searching when they've been deployed into the UI. Because searching in the code repository is really great for optimization, for repetition, that kind of thing. But searching in the UI is when it comes down to actually using it and getting the value and the benefit of creating them. The last thing I want to go over is you can talk about some really interesting things here. You could decide to use different versions of different providers for different, because the only time you would use a different version of a provider in Terraform is if the API version is different for different things. So if config has changed in one and you want to use an earlier version of the config, that's only going to matter on the resource because the config itself doesn't really know anything about the actual resource type. The config itself doesn't know anything about your business unit or the application itself. It only really knows about the resource you're trying to create. For example, if you're trying to create an alert or a dashboard or TCO rules. So when you index on the type, you can have different versions of the same provider. For example, the Coralogix provider, and you can make the most of the different versions that are available. So it's just a small trick. I would generally advise trying to stay on the same version of the provider if you can, but it's a trick that's available to you. And it can be quite powerful if you get, like I say, if you scale, if you get more complex with how you lay things out. This is just a quick summary of how how one may decide to lay out the code. It's really important just to go over some of the key points, and of course, just as a final addition, you can add things like readmes and say to people, look through this repository, look for alerts that already exist, look for dashboards that already exist that solve your problem, look for queries that already exist that are very similar to what you're trying to do. Paula has asked for the code layout. Would this work for New Relic as well? I'm not super familiar with how New Relic solves that particular problem. If they use something like Terraform, then I mean these concepts are pretty transferable. There are resources you're trying to create and business units and applications. They're almost always going to exist in every single provider. So I presume yes. If it doesn't work out for you, come talk to Coralogix. It's going to be great. But if they yes, they use Terraform. So yeah, these concepts will work. It's really all about, like I say, Paula, it's really all about picking the way you want to index your resources such that you can search them, analyze them, and most importantly, optimize them. Because after a while, you're going to have lots and lots of dashboards, and they may if New Relic's pricing works that way, they may charge you per dashboard or per user or per alert or whatever. And you can optimize, and you can actually lower your costs because you can see all that repetition. It's really in front of you. So that was a run through of the decoupled approach, and I think Jonathan is going to take the wheel now to have a look at the coupled approach and the relevant and how that sort of juxtaposes against this approach and what the benefits you may get are.
Yeah, so something I think I want to hit on, and I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can look at some code together. Something I want to hit on that I think is very pertinent to this conversation, right, is the idea of resource ownership, right? When I think of coupling versus decoupling resources, I think, well, who's responsible for when you get a call at 2 a.m. because something broke, right? Who's responsible for being able to act on fixing a thing? So like Chris said, I'm actually taking the coupled resource example. And so what we're looking at right now is a repository that's a full stack Next application, right? So it's got a front end, a back end, it's got some jobs. But what we're really looking at here will be this. It's a super simple visit spec in Playwright. It's literally just going to a URL, making sure that a certain API request is fired and it comes back as a 200. We're waiting for the network to idle. We're confirming that the page has a certain title, right? So there's nothing really fancy going on here, but who would write this sort of test, right? Who would write a super simple basic API test as well to confirm that, you know, those book API requests are doing what they should be doing regardless of environment? More than likely, it would be a full stack engineer, maybe a backend engineer would also be writing an API test as well. But here we're looking at a front end repository that has both of these sort of tests baked in, right? For me, the question is why? And it's because developers own this, right? People, the person managing this actual application, this directory, they own this. So if something goes wrong, like you can't log in, unless there's an AWS outage or something like that, they're going to be the one saying, oh yeah, the intern updated the login button, our bad, right? So it's all of a sudden really important for that team who has the responsibility of maintaining this application to be able to own their resources. So for me, coupled approaches work best in this sort of environment. When I think of decoupled approaches and the folks that gravitate to them, like Jeff, I know Jeff, hi Jeff, like Jeff, it's because his part of the organization is managing resources for a lot of different teams, right? And that's how they're getting the most value out of adopting a solution in that way. So if we look at this example, I'm actually wanting to start implementing a beta feature that Replay just launched here recently, and that's to match, to have screenshot, right? What I want to do is that anytime I run this test, I want to make sure that it looks the right way every single time, right? I don't want this test to be broken. I don't want it to be okay if all these responses fire off, but then, you know, the page looks wonky. So let's actually see what we can do here, right? So I'm actually going to run this command here. You see at the bottom of my screen in the terminal to update snapshots because we don't have any snapshots yet. So what this is doing is that it will be running all of my tests or all of my checks, right? And this isn't running on my machine. It's actually running on AWS locations, right? Because that's how Checkly works. So all of these browser specs and API checks ran very quickly. Oh, sorry, accidentally paused the share because Zoom. So that's great. Everything checked out. So let's go ahead and do something like this. We're going to pass this record flag. And then we're going to see how this performs, right? At this point, we have our golden image here. We know that our site looks like this. We're running that test like we wanted to. Hey, and it looks like everything checked out. Now, because Checkly is doing really cool things with monitoring his code, like uniting testing and monitoring, I can actually go to my Checkly test session and see for that spec that everything turned out the way that it should, right? So the snapshot's only recorded for the failed result. That's great. Now, let's see what happens if I do something like, I don't know, drop all of this, and then instead of go to the right page, I do something like, of course, I have a pen in my mouth, so that was smart. But here we are. Live demo is what we're doing today. Let's see how this goes. So I'm going to go ahead and record this test again. Because again, I'm a front end engineer, maybe I'm a full stack engineer, and I'm working on staging. Maybe I broke something, maybe I didn't. And this test is taking longer because it's going to fail. We know it's going to fail because we're confident in our beta features that are open to the public. And then you see things like this, right? I can look at, hey, this thing failed. What's the difference? Wow, that's very different. The reason why, right, I'm pointing to this example as something that really shows you the value of coupling your resources, because I already own these tests. I'm the one who has ownership of them. Would it not make sense for me to continue to work on them at my leisure in the easiest way possible, right? Using Playwright. So we know this works, and maybe we want to make some other changes, right? I'm actually using, one second as I click the wrong thing. I'm actually using Checkly to automatically say what frequency things will be running at. So let's actually update that from 5 minutes, every 5 minutes to every 30 minutes, because it's against a staging environment. So I don't want the staging environment to be visited that frequently. I kind of don't care that much, right? And in addition to that, maybe I also want to do something like update our dashboard. I cheated. I already know a logo that exists, and it's actually at the Coralogix site. So we're gonna use that. And I want my dashboard to have a Checkly logo. So all we're going to do now is we're just going to deploy these changes, because I'm fine with pressing enter and saying YOLO every now and then. So that's what we're doing. We're going to say yes here. And then we're going to go ahead and visit and see if those changes happened, right, with Checkly. And as you can see, just in a few moments, I've been able to do things like update a logo for a dashboard. I've been able to update the actual time of the frequency duration of these checks running, right? I've also just in moments implemented visual comparison testing, all because I'm able to work in a coupled environment. So, Chris, do you have any thoughts or questions about what we've just looked at here together?
So there's a bunch of questions that have come through, so you're going to be hounded with them, I'm afraid. I just want to add, imagine, um, if you on top of that level of ownership with these synthetic tests, you also have clear visibility of where the dashboards are. And I really loved that thing at the end where you change the units in the UI. That level of control, I think it's really nice. People often know who owns an application; they don't know who owns a dashboard. And so a way of guaranteeing ownership is through that coupled approach. It's gorgeous. I love it. So first one isn't a question, just a statement of admiration from Jeff. Jonathan is super helpful in his guidance. By the way, we have a great start working with Checkly. So you have a fan. Awesome. This is good.
Thanks, Jeff.
So Aaron has asked, is it possible to run Lighthouse audits in a Checkly Playwright? Check.
That's interesting. I haven't seen that done yet. I know that you can run Lighthouse audits with Playwright, I believe. I would have to double check to see if any of our user base has started looking at how to run Lighthouse audits with Checkly. So great question. We actually have a Slack community for Checkly that it's open and available to anyone. We have 2 out of the 10 playwright ambassadors in the world that work for Checkly. So if you're interested, we'll drop some links. Come visit our site, ask some questions there, and then you can say, Jonathan didn't know the answer to this question, so everyone can be really mad at me. Anything else, Chris?
Yes, there is one more, which is there are a couple now, actually. In the coupled approach, I see tests that go to a URL. In theory, the code of the app should be deployed to above said URL before the tests run. How is this accomplished in a CI/CD environment?
That's a great question. I thought someone would never ask. So great, right? What you're actually looking at, and I won't jump into it too far here. This application is actually using a GitHub action, right? That it actually runs your Checkly tests after a merge has occurred. If those tests pass, then it deploys those checks, as you can see here, it deploys those checks to staging or to main or wherever you like. If they fail, it actually reverts the code to the last changes that had occurred previously. So you're spot on. I think in this example, what I'm showing is how easily you can start hacking on a project with Checkly, and then take some steps to go ahead and get rolling as you kind of move forward in adopting for CI/CD and things like that. And I'm also using a defaults file here that says, hey, if it's production, do this. If it's staging, do this. Also different users, different URLs. So yeah, spot on. This repo is actually publicly available, modern-sapien in GitHub. If you want access to it, feel free to snag it.
I'm becoming conscious of time because we are pushing up at the
We
end.
can roll forward.
Yeah. Let's crack on. That was really great. Yeah. I'm not convinced. I'm still on the decoupled camp, but I'd love to hear in the chat actually if anyone has been swayed or if anyone has a particular opinion. So we talked very briefly about what's next. So today was all about leveling those foundations out and making sure that we have an understanding of what some of the sort of first principles challenges are that we have to overcome, some of the first decisions we have to make to have a real success with this kind of thing. As well, I think we've covered some of the differences between monitoring as code and infrastructure as code as well, because it's not completely transferable. The next sessions are going to be very hands-on keyboard, very specific. We're going to be getting into some of the real meat of what's going on. The meat and potatoes, thank you, Jonathan. I love that phrase, of really diving into the world of monitoring as code, especially around challenges and solutions next time. So the problems you're going to run into as you scale, as you grow. And secondarily, you can look at tooling and implementations in the final webinar on December the 5th. And that one is going to get really specific, CI/CD and different CLI tools and much, much more. So we're going to have we're going to have a lot of fun with that. It's going to be really interesting. There is one quick question, which is it possible to have the best of both worlds, a coupled and decoupled approach?
Oh man. Oh yes. I love this. It is possible. We're actually working with some folks that are doing this right now. It is a lot of work, and it will take some real planning and strategy around your implementation. That's what happens with pioneers and trailblazers. So maybe you're one of them. But but absolutely, it's possible for sure.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, it's possible. You can have some resources with the application, some resources central. There's a risk, multiple strategies, multiple standards. It could cause some headaches. We have to wrap up there, guys, but thank you very much for attending. It was a great turnout, loads and loads of questions. There is an ask that we have the name of the repository shown here by Jonathan.
Yeah.
To make available. We'll make that available to you guys. Jonathan, can you put it into the chat maybe or something? Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm trying now. That's the
Awesome.
GitHub username, and then the repo is like, what is it called? Oh, I don't know the name of the repo off the top of my head. That's the one thing I got wrong this call.
That's
It will
fine. That's fine. What
be
we'll do is we'll send out an email after the webinar is done, and we will include within it the name of the repository as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully, see you all and more in the second episode of the series where we dive into the challenges and solutions. So, thank you, everyone. This was Monitoring as Code from Checkly and Coralogix.
remember year, month, date. Catch you later.